It's become common to understand the brain as left brain versus right brain. Why do you make the distinction that we need to understand it as front versus back?
Yeah, a lot of things that are super popular in pop psych have their place in their kernel of truth, but get sort of overemphasized. So people walk around thinking like, I'm a left brain, I'm a logical person, right? Like I'm a rotator, right? And you're like a language feeling person, even though language is also a lot of it's left brain, but you're like an emotional person, I'm a logical person. But almost all of us have both of those tendencies, and a lot of that research came from people who had brain injury, right? So like something happens on the left side of their brain, they can't produce grammatical speech anymore. Something happens on the right side of their brain, they can't put proper emotional inflection. So it's not that there's nothing to that, but there's no evidence that people switch into a purely right versus left brain mode, even, right? Whereas we know that the brain tends to be organized across almost everyone, with most of our sensation happening in the back of the brain, and then most of the responses happening as information flows from the back end of the brain to the front of the brain. Um, and we don't think so much about whether that system is balanced. So, I mean, yes, logic versus emotion might be important to think a little bit about what the balance is there, but almost all of our formal education is just pushing us more to the front of the brain, like respond in more sophisticated ways, learn different types of responses, learn more advanced, like, expert responses. And there's very little education, unless you're like an artist doing art training, about like learning to also develop your ability to perceive differently, right? How you're going to take in information differently, because the types of responses you make, no matter how elegant, are always going to be constrained by what you're perceiving. And so to think that we're spending so much time trying to just curate and develop the front of our brains in formal education, and almost nothing once we get past the early elementary school, nursery, finger painting, stuff like that, we just like, oh, we're done with that, we're not going to work on that whole backside of our brain, when it's very clearly dedicated towards building up sensory percepts into things that we can recognize as objects and experiences. Seems kind of silly, because it's so available to us, right? And there's so many historically cultural practices that are about also enriching that sort of back side of the brain, like listening to music, going taking art, like doing things with your body, and looking at how you feel. But we don't really have a pop psych concept of, oh, I need to tone the back of my brain a little bit. And whereas like if you're always doing, I don't know, bicep curls, someone would be like, oh, you're just doing pulling exercises, you're never doing pushing exercises. That's, you can get big fronts of your arms, but that's not really like ideal, right? It would be ideal to do the counter move as well. Sometimes some days have to be push days, not just pull days, right? If you want to use like weightlifting. So I think there's an equivalent to that in terms of how our brains are set up, that most of our exercises are respond exercises, not perceive exercises. And you see very successful people who are just like, they're called like, they're just really stubborn or closed-minded. You can't get through to them once they have an idea about things, because they don't have the same, they have this really advanced ability to coordinate responses, and almost like no ability to reflect on how they're perceiving the situation. They just take what their first perception as the ground truth, when of course that itself is also mutable if you're able to take time to be like, well, what if I looked at it from this angle? What if I took another information? Am I really sure I'm seeing things the right way? Or could I be inspired if I saw things in a different way, or have different emotional responses if I saw things a different way? The ways that you respond are a downstream product of the way you've set up your perception. So it behooves us to spend some time also thinking about the idea that we couldn't cultivate perceptual skills.